famous, very simple digital circuit for timing and square wave generation, and then a capacitor to drive like a breathing LED effect, and it was supposed to light a quartz crystal pendant. The components I soldered all together and actually crammed them into more of these sculpey crafted beads designed to hide all the electronics. I had a bunch of had battery cells along the back, and it's over there to take a look at as well. Using the structure of the necklace to route the power and the signals. It is unfortunately really chunky, really heavy. It has a very handmade look, and it was not at all to my ex's taste. I didn't have a terribly strong sense of aesthetic then, but I really loved the process of engineering something to be beautiful, and it was the first circuit, though very simple, that I had actually designed and implemented from scratch. So that felt like a big step up. Jumping ahead to 2015, there's an event, I don't know if it's still going on, but it was a part of ManyFest called the Electric Donkey Run, and it was a evening 5K glow fun run. People would get decked out in all kinds of neon, glow-in-the-dark glow sticks, LEDs, and so on. And I wanted to go, and I wanted to bring my own flavor to that. So I built something that would crowdsource animation commands from Twitter. While I was running, I called it Blinky Hat, and it's unfortunately non-functional, but it is also over there. It was intentionally garish, and it wasn't super robust, but had managed to build a wearable that tethered a Raspberry Pi to my phone so that it could watch a Twitter account, and then people could remote control the hat. So you would tweet some simple commands like red, blue, marquee, and then it would light up red and blue. There were, I think, 7 animation commands and a variety of colors that would respond to. Since I was using, since I had a full Linux computer at my disposal, I was able to write the app as just like a Python script using a Twitter API library and leveraging the OS to provide internet support. So that made things really simple. And I learned, unfortunately, that getting people to interact with things is much harder. Especially since they had never seen this before, they didn't know what it was. I'm running past them. There's no real chance to sit down and explain it. And so, obviously, if you can't interact with something and it doesn't, it's not inviting, then it's not going to grab anyone's curiosity. Earlier in that year, I had also attended something called the Game Developers Conference in San Francisco and caught Brian Moriarty's postmortem on his game Loom. Loom is a graphic fantasy adventure where you play a young weaver/wizard on a quest to reunite with his guild after they were turned into swans. And it's all set to the score of Swan Lake. It was a LucasArts production, just a gorgeous game. I'd been gaming for a long time, but that was the first time that I'd ever played something that made me go, this is what I want to do for a living. And I also fell in love with the world and the character, and I had wanted to do a Bobbin Threadbare costume, the protagonist, since I was a kid. And so, having met Brian, I decided that that was going to be the year that I made it happen. The Loom staff itself is just lights up 8 different colors. As you go through the game, you learn spells based on the C major scale, and you cast these 4-note songs. And you're clicking, but in the lore of the game, the Bobbin's actually singing to the staff. And so I realized if I didn't sing to the staff, I wasn't going to be happy with the result. I thought about other kinds of interfaces, buttons, maybe something that I could play like a trumpet or something like that, but no, it was going to sing. At Complex, we had done some iPhone karaoke software as a previous project, so I had some experience with signal processing stuff, but I hadn't done it with an Arduino, didn't have a microphone for it, had to build that circuit, and unfortunately I forgot the staff, but I do have some photos if anyone wants to see it later. It took way more time to build the code for this and get that working than I thought, and so the staff really ended up being a bit of an afterthought. It was just a tree branch that I'd found in my backyard, and the electronics were so bulky that I took like a wooden jewelry box from Michael's that you're supposed to paint or something, and screwed it onto the top and covered it in brown paper bags, like lunch bags, hot glued, and like dry brushed paint, and just did whatever I could to make it look more tree-like, and it just a disaster. So the 3 lessons that I learned from that project were that I needed to give myself more than a month to work on something. Good idea to experiment with fabrication processes ahead of time, get a sense of what can and won't work. And then specific to audio projects, if you're working with any kind of signal analysis stuff, try to get it to work on simulated stuff so you can work out the kinks in the software ahead of time, because otherwise, unless you have a soundproof environment, your loved ones are going to want to kill you, and it doesn't matter how much they like the sound of your voice. It was a lot of nights in my basement singing at this thing and trying to make sure that it was lighting up the right colors. 2017, I discovered that I'm transgender and started to cultivate my own sense of fashion, and I realized that these ideas that I'd been having for dresses, jewelry, and various other kinds of things were probably meant more for me than people I wanted to gift them to, especially since these things are all really prototypey. They're not the easiest things to get along with. They break. You need to know how to repair them in the field. I've had people ask me if I could make them one or sell them one, and I'm just like, you don't want that. You're gonna, that'll be the end of our friendship. And following in my mom's slow fashion footsteps, she made a lot of her, or pretty much all of her clothing. I've inherited her sewing machine. I've been trying to connect more with the fiber arts and traditional crafting mediums as a way of building these things that I make, as opposed to working in more modern techniques with printed circuit boards and 3D printing and all this other kind of stuff. So I'll buy and I'll modify things where it makes sense, but it's been really nice to kind of make things by hand and imbue them with light and sound. So I hadn't intended to make anything for Halloween that year, but when I was costume shopping with the kids, came across a rainbow skirt and a kind of trans-colored unicorn wig, and so I was like, well, okay, that's costume. I'm gonna make that work. So I had more of the LEDs left over from the Blinky Hat. I made this, took this rainbow skirt, added a bunch of LEDs, got it blinking sort of a twinkle effect using the tiny Arduino that was part of the Loom staff, which is why I can't demo that. And powered it with a small phone charger just hidden in the elastic. Surprisingly, phone chargers actually expect you to be hooking a phone up to them. So they're a great source of power, but if the draw on your project is too small, then the charger shuts off after a few seconds. And so I discovered this by trial and error. As I'm like, okay, I'm testing this, I'm running it off of my laptop, everything's fine. I plug it into the charger, it runs for 5 seconds and then stops. And I'm like, did it crash? What's going on? Realized I'm actually not, it's just not bright enough. So I actually cranked up the brightness on the LEDs to draw more power to keep the thing running, and it's shown up in a couple of other projects that I've done, so it was a good lesson to learn. And then the horn and the wig had something called a Blinkum LED, and they still make them. They're really cool. They are these little programmable RGB LEDs, and they retain the program so that all you have to do is just apply power later on, and they run on a range of voltages from about 3 to 7 volts. So because this was crammed into a little horn on a wig, I handcrafted a battery holder for 3 LR44 button cells out of some thermoplastic beads and some wire for hanging pictures, and just kind of all jury-rigged it together. That's over there. I'm happy to have people take a look at that. And in both cases, the code was so much simpler that it was really just mostly focused on the physical construction this time. I've been trying to move, my background is software development, not so much the crafting side of things. So it's been a journey of going from, okay, I can do all kinds of really complicated things in software. I don't know how to sew. Hopefully a future version of, so the problem that I had with the skirt was because I was using like LEDs on a ribbon, those are pretty good in terms of flexibility, but they don't hold up well to repeated mechanical stress. And so putting it onto a skirt where it's getting bunched, you're sitting on it, you're doing kinds of things, they started to break, started to short out. It's very persnickety. I can probably get all of them to light, but sometimes just a few of them do, and then like others get stuck. Yeah, there's much easier to work with individual LEDs or things that are more on boards. Around Christmas of 2017, learned about something called AdaBox. And so there's a company called Adafruit Industries, and they power most of the things that I've built since. Their subscription service lets you, they send you 4 times a year a curated box that contains a platform and then a whole bunch of accessories designed to allow you to make a bunch of projects kind of right out of the gate. It's a really, really great way to get started. I recommend them to people who want to get their feet wet, because if you have no idea what you're buying and you don't really know, like, they'll just ship you everything you need to make at least 6 or 7 different things, and then as you start to collect these boxes, it's easy to start mixing and matching pieces. And that really helped. It's called Adafruit. Adafruit Industries. They're in New York, and then the curated box is called an AdaBox. I think they're up to like 15 now. You can order past ones if they've got the parts in stock, but otherwise it's an ongoing subscription. Works out to about $70 a quarter, which I find really reasonable, especially since shipping otherwise from the US with electronics tends to be really prohibitive. So in 2018, for Halloween, this time it was my eldest who wanted help with a costume, which is that orange monstrosity over there. He wanted a Minecraft pumpkin head, and I'd just gotten the Halloween AdaBox, which was themed around making spooky props for your home. And so the board itself is really designed around interactive audio-visual, and I told my son that we could make his mask wearable, and he was elated. So the mask itself wasn't super hard to construct, just painted cardboard box. Few engineering problems to solve. We ended up using, it doesn't fit on the shoulders, so there's a harness in there that's made out of grocery bags, and we discovered that the chains, while they're a nice spooky aesthetic, are really there to add enough weight to the mask so that it doesn't just fall over constantly when it's sitting on you. So they're there for ballast. The concept was just some red LED eyes, and there's tinfoil back there that helps the light to shine out the front. And then the Halloween has a onboard accelerometer, and so those are used primarily to determine the orientation of something. And so the box responds to 3 different tilt commands. If you tilt it to the side, it says trick or treat, and if you tilt it forward, as if you were bowing, it says thank you, and if you tilt backwards, it gives off this really evil, spooky, mwahaha kind of laugh. And that one is functional. I'm happy to let people wear it, try it out. So my eldest we recorded him saying these phrases in a few different variations, and we ran them through Audacity to just spooky them up. I had not really done much with audio processing, done signal analysis, not actual audio editing. Basically just applied a couple of different filters until things sounded sufficiently gritty, and then saved them to the board. And he got through the whole evening, several bags of candy, didn't say a word to anyone. And everyone thought it was the coolest thing ever. So then 2019, almost the end, my girlfriend and I had planned to attend the Art City Gala, not knowing necessarily what it was going to be about. The previous year had been a flower theme, and then they announced the theme was going to be true colors. And at that point, I couldn't have possibly imagined a better theme for a wearable. It's a nighttime dance party, it's an art auction, so I wanted something artistic and centered around dancing, that would have vivid palettes and animations that would sync with music. So the Christmas Ada box that I had got contained something called a Trellis M4, which is basically like a little 32-button hackable DJ pad. And it had a really good analog digital signal processor. So the grand idea was to build a pair of LED butterfly wings. This pad would function as like the control interface for, but it would also be able to listen to the music to do beat detection, maybe try to modulate the animations based on what kinds of frequencies are present in the music. And this whole project pushed me much harder than anything that I had done. I never built anything that needed to be that durable before, and anything that needed to be not ugly for a change. It was going to be potentially outdoors, so it needed to possibly be water resistant. It needed to be able to run for 6 hours and be eye-catching. So and then because I wanted to be able to adjust a lot of these parameters, the animations, the colors, and whatnot on the fly, I had to build a whole user interface around this 32-button pad. So there was the UI, there was the animations. I had several months for this one, but it was a lot of things to solve, a lot of code to write. The main way that I made sure that I didn't run out of time was I made a design decision early on to have the wings have 32 panels as well. So whatever was on the pad would just be echoed to the rear, and then that way I could basically trust that the software, if it was working, would just run on the wings as the display. Ran out of time on the audio features. I'm hoping to add that as a later thing, but it forced me to improvise on a beat detection method that I think actually worked out better anyway, which was basically me. I added you could tap the rhythm on a button without bringing up the user interface, and after 8 taps, it would lock into the new frequency and resynchronize so it would update the tempo, but it would also make sure that it hadn't fallen out of phase. So it would, as long as you were on tempo, it would synchronize, and if you could make it that your 8th beat was actually like the 1 count, then it looked perfect. So the physical side was where most of the effort went into. Had the awful idea of hand wiring all of the LEDs. So there are 96 LEDs to make 32 panels of 3 LED triangles. It's really nice, it's really bright, but it was about 3 days almost nonstop. I took a couple days off work at the end. I got it all done in time, but literally an hour before I left for the party. I was just finished, makeup, go. And then there's a harness bra that was made just out of elastic. There's a metal ring in the front. I taped some magnets onto the back of the pad so that it like magnetically clamps on. You can remove it so that you can work with the interface and then put it back on if you need to. The real challenge actually though was the power supply, because this is the most LEDs that I'd ever tried to light at once while making something portable. And the pad itself caps out at about 400 milliamps, which is more than enough for the device itself and the LEDs that it needs to run, but it could not drive the whole display on its own. I needed about an amp more for that, and I'm using like a 10-hour 2-port phone charger pack, and each port's rated for 2 amps, so that would have been fine, except that it kept limiting it to half an amp, and it was because, again, phone charger, expecting to talk to a phone. Fast-charging phones will negotiate with these devices to figure out what the maximum speed is, but there's a hack where you basically, if you short the data pins on a USB cable so you're only dealing with the power, it goes, okay, we assume you know what you're doing and we're just going to give you the full amount of current, which turned out really cool because even though I only needed an amp for the display for this particular show, I took it out in pride last summer and was able to crank it up to the full, like, so it's 10 watts of light coming off these wings. And then final project is the one that I've been wearing throughout all of this. So wanted to try and start working on more practical kind of LED jewelry. A couple years back for Nuit Blanche, I had made an armband that I had knit in linen stitch to use as a diffuser, mounted all the electronics on the inside and just kind of strapped it down. Took the bars and the microcontroller from it and turned them into this choker necklace and earrings. So there's wires at the back, and they just connect to the earrings to provide the power and the data signal. This is probably my favorite platform because basically I just write new animations as I think of them. So there was just a basic kind of twinkle effect initially left over from the skirt. It later evolved into a rainbow-themed kind of pulsing rainbow, and then what it's running right now is a really, really rough approximation of a paper that I read on how to render Aurora Borealis in computer graphics. So there's not a lot of display space, but it's essentially kind of pretending like it's simulating high energy particles hitting the atmosphere and then trying to emit colors based on what it would expect to see. You'll have to judge for yourself whether or not it looks sufficiently awesome. Thank you. Yeah, and it doesn't draw a lot of power, so it's just got like a tiny little lithium polymer battery on the band, and I've had it run for more than 10 hours on a charge, so it's worked out really well. Don't actually consider myself to be an artist. I do game development on the technical side, writing software. I've been more like a clockmaker or an engineer. And none of these projects really had like a point or a message. They were just a thing that I wanted to make. But for me, I think the creativity and the expression behind them counts. So it's been really neat to see the tech continue to get smaller and smaller. And also for it to shift into the software, right? The kit era stuff that I was talking about at the beginning, you needed to know a lot about how these components, resistors, capacitors, transistors, how they all fit together to make complicated circuits. And now, really all you're doing is taking various transducers, so things that like microphones, LEDs, things that convert some kind of energy into electricity or back, and then you just route them into the computer, you write software, it does all the work, and it means that one chip can do pretty much everything, as long as you can explain the software to it. So I've been able to transfer a lot of the programming skills that I've built up over the last 2 decades to do some pretty advanced things without having really any engineering knowledge. Most of these things plug together, and it honestly feels a little bit like magic. You're just storytelling math to wafers of silicon and then bringing fashion to life. For people who, I mean, I'm assuming everyone here, with the exception of Lee, is local, but the really interesting thing about trying to build these projects is that it sends me all over the city. So I'm just as likely to be found at Home Depot or Princess Auto as I am like Michael's or Fabricland or Artist Emporium. And usually for the electronics, I get them from the internet, but for everything else, I tend to source locally just because when I'm experimenting, kind of impatient, don't really know what's going to work. I definitely learned that you can't really expect the people at the stores to help you with those design problems either. So it's like the best I can do is either say I need a thing that supports us. Like you describe the properties you're looking for, not so much the thing that you want, and then they'll give you some suggestions, and you buy a couple of them and try them out and see what works. The one thing I wish that I had learned earlier though was to buy more connectors. Early projects were basically all just soldered together, and then I had to unsolder them to move components around to future projects. If you don't have enough connectors, things are really hard to repair. They're hard to make modular, and And there's lots of options. I discovered there's a whole world of like automotive connectors for stuff, and as long as your wires are large enough, then they work really well. And between Princess Auto and radio supply stores, there's actually a fair number of access to components that you can get along those lines. But otherwise, those are the kinds of things where it's really cheap and really effective to just pre-order them ahead of time, because you just want a bulk selection of connectors without having to necessarily know which one you're going to need in advance. And that's essentially it. Thank you very much for your attention. We're going to have Q&A later, and I'll have time to walk people through the various projects if they want to take a look at them hands-on or even wear them. And with that, I will turn things over to Lee. So thank you.
I like that I've started this with you guys knowing my secret that I'm just like a chaotic being. So yeah, first of all, I just want to say thank you for having me here. I have never been to this province or city, and it's great. Everyone's been super welcoming. So thank you, Creative Manitoba, for inviting me out here, and thank you, John, for moderating the panel, and Adrian. It was really great to hear you speak about that stuff. I really resonate with what you're saying about like finding weird stuff. Like all of the people know me at the local Home Depot. They're like, oh no. This weird person's coming in again, buying like construction equipment for not what it's for. So yeah, you are not alone. So yeah, I'm gonna talk to you guys about a variety of different things. So yeah, like a little bit about me. First, I guess I wear a lot of hats. So I'm an adjunct professor. I teach at OCAD University in Toronto and also at Ryerson University. And I teach 2 classes mostly, some other things too, but mostly a class called Physical Computing and another class called Cybernetics and Body-Centric Technologies, which is a name I made up, which is why it sounds good, but not because it's like a fancy class or anything. I'm also a PhD student at the University of Toronto. I'm pretty involved in the maker scene. Mostly across Toronto, but also fairly across Canada. I guess I'm still an artist, and by being a PhD student, technically a researcher, wearable technologist, cyborg, and also a really community-oriented human. So I'm going to talk to you guys at first a little bit about some of the community initiatives that I do, and the stuff I'm interested in, and then I'll talk to you guys a bit about my research and how that relates to the stuff I make. So yeah, I didn't really know what to talk about, so I talk about the moon quite a bit, so if that's not what you're here for, I'm sorry. So an event I'm really excited about that I've ran for a number of years in Toronto is the Stupid Stuff Nobody Needs and Terrible Ideas Hackathon. So I know this runs in a number of different cities if you folks do happen to find yourself through Toronto at the end of the month. It's really a fun event where we sort of like critique technology and talk about why it's awful, because let's face it, like it's the worst, yeah. So the most fun I have every year is designing these completely absurd posters. This year we have Elon's Musk. So yeah, I mean, it's a good time. So these events happen actually all around the world. So, but you can follow us, the Stupid Hack Toronto, if you're curious the garbage that we make. I also run an annual conference called Make Change, which is about creating maker culture and social change. So how we can change the way we think about making stuff and make that kind of different. And for a number of years, I was chair, and I also ran Women's and LGBTQ Alliance Nights at a local makerspace in Toronto, Site 3, which is one of the oldest makerspaces in Toronto. So basically, it's just an open, inclusive night with the goal of like centering people who want to learn different kinds of things. So yeah, that's the kind of stuff I do with the community, but most of my work and my artistic practice exists sort of at the intersection of bodies and technology, and that's changed over a couple of years to mean various different things. But lately I'm stuck on this thing that that I call squishy futures. So squishy futures is sort of like a speculative kind of framework that I'm using to think about the future in a different way. And so this is sort of like the area that I present a lot of my PhD research, which also relates to my artistic practice, and we'll talk a bit about what that means, because I know it sounds like nonsense. So a lot of it is talking about this idea of hard and soft technology, and also that exists in hard and soft skills. So hard and soft often pitted against each other forever. But we think of hard technology as the kind of technology that we use every day. So like our computers and our phones, everything that like physically is hard. And soft technology would be something that's like e-textiles or like a biological future, or all these different kinds of futures, technologies that are made out of different things. And we'll start to see, like hopefully as I go through this, that if we want technology and the body to exist together, we have to stop thinking about technology in this like framework that we have. But also I like to think of hard and soft technology. My work focuses a lot about craft and about thinking about how craft can be technology. So a lot of like the skills that are said to be relevant to technology are what we call hard skills. So learning how to code and learning how to be an engineer, which I love doing. So I say that like I don't love those things. But and then soft skills like design, right? But design is a very technical skill, and textile skills are very technical skills. So this idea of like hard and soft is both like a physical understanding of technology, but also like a conceptual understanding of knowledge. So the questions that I'm really thinking about a lot are how can we think of technology differently? So we have a pretty good idea of what technology is, but why do we think about it the way we do, and why do we keep designing things that look and feel the same? My ultimate question is because I'm thinking about the future and how we can design and shape technologies for our future. So this, some of you might know what this is. This is the Apollo lander, and that bag is a bag of human waste on the moon. I think there's 86 bags on the moon, and there's just a whole bunch of just general trash there. And this is sort of this is a map of all the moon trash. And I've been thinking a lot about this because really what I'm thinking about is how we're really bad at space, but we really want to go there. And I feel like that's a big problem of bodies, and that's a big problem of bodies and technology, and how those things are together and how we conceptualize them together. Because when we're in our everyday world, we don't necessarily have to think about how our body interacts with the environment, but so we can build things that are shaped differently than our bodies, or like are not super comfortable, and that doesn't really matter because we're not as dependent on it. But as soon as we go to space, we immediately have to build something that like seamlessly integrates with our body and seamlessly allows us to do all the same things we were doing before. So a lot of my work is about speculative next-generation space technologies, and what's really fun about this is that we haven't invented them yet. So we don't know what they are. I think a lot of people have a lot of ideas. So I make a lot of artwork that thinks about ideas of machine and the machine and technology and the body, and how we can sort of bring these things closer together. And they are sort of varying degrees related to the concept of space, but a lot of them are related to the challenges that we face going to space. So technology isn't inherently at odds with the human form, but we've certainly created a system that encourages it. So my work's about untangling that system. So there's no reason why technology has to be the way it is, but now it's much easier to make it because there's supply chains that make that easier. There's the way we learn knowledge that makes that easier. So it's really hard to unlearn those things and to think about them differently. So I was thinking a lot about portable environments. And this, will my GIF work? There it is. Okay, so this is a piece called Void that I've been working on for a couple of years, and it's it's about portable environments. It's about self-perception. It's about also about your perceived self. So basically, it's made out of this acrylic film that has a coating on it. It's actually the same coating you find on like big buildings that they look like a mirror in the daytime, but at night you can see in. So that's the type of technology that I'm using here. And basically there's LEDs on the inside and the outside, and if the outside LED is lit up, then it looks like a window. And if the inside LED is lit up, then it looks like a mirror. But that's opposite to the person whose head is inside it. So when it looks like a mirror, the other person can see out. And when it looks like a window, that person can only see a reflection of themselves. So what's really interesting about this piece is that there's two people looking at each other, and as they look at each other, as one person can view the other person is absorbed in their own reflection. But also just thinking about how the materials that we make, our technologies, how they create these environments that are immersive and that sort of engulf us completely in the experience. So this is it's actually going up for in a gallery tomorrow for a few weeks, and you know, I encourage people to put their head in and experience the void, as it were. So I'm also thinking a lot about the seamless transfer of information and the symbiosis of performer and apparatus, or equipment and person. So this happens a lot, like if we take it back to our spacesuits, when you're designing something, you don't want to have to, the seamless transfer of information is basically how you interpret information. So for example, when my phone vibrates, I immediately know there's a notification and I don't have to spend time interpreting that information. But depending on the design of objects, they can be more or less intuitive, and the information can require more or less interpretation. So trying to create these this type of symbiosis where the machine itself is transferring information and absorbing information and relaying information, and the person wearing it doesn't have to think about that. So I have this piece that I made with my collaborator Hilary Predko, and that is being worn today by Anthony. So it's called Android Apparatus. So Android Apparatus is a piece that we designed for a circus performer in a very specific play, and she was a lyra dancer, so that's performance on a hoop. So the performance was originally made so that as the full hoop spins, there's an accelerometer in the garment, and that you know, changes the color of the LEDs. So you can see here that with different movements, this changes. Of course, you know, he's not on a hoop, so the interaction's a bit different. But yeah, the other big design challenge that we faced with this was creating something that that was going to work with the performer. So you can see that it goes across one arm. The reason it goes across one arm is because she needs her other arm to hold the hoop. And it also has elastics and you know, is meant to stretch and move with the body. Yeah, but it also has this sort of armor aesthetic as well. So basically, to design this, what we did was we made like a heat map of the body, basically looking at where she grabbed, you know, the different elements and what things she needed, and then we created this design. And we also thought about the different locations of the body that are moving. So you can see there's on the chest, there's the electronics, and the chest, it's placed there because the arm is making sort of unpredictable movements, whereas the chest reflects like the general body orientation. So this was also, you can see the patterns on it as well, on the shoulder and all on the arm. This is data that we had gathered from the original choreography of the dance that it was originally made for. Yeah, thank you so much for, yeah. So basically, the data is gathered from an accelerometer, and it's etched onto the piece. So the piece itself, like, is made up of the information being used. So this is a visualization of the data that's laser cut into this whole piece. So yeah, that was sort of like our attempt at like creating a symbiosis between the performer, the performance, and the device itself. So thank you very much. This is the device, yeah. But a lot of this comes down to a material problem. So this is the slide I had at the beginning, and this is basically a color changing, or it's called the Lcd Chromatic Pigment, and the Lcd Chromatic Pigment basically changes color based on heat, and the entire piece is, it is sewn with resistive thread. So the resistive thread, when we put current through it, it makes heat, and that changes the color of the piece. So it really looks like, it has like a very unique look to it. It looks like pretty wild and unearthly, but also it's sort of a demonstration of different ways that we can use this technology. So you might actually know this technology already from the most unlikely place. If you guys remember like the Coors beer, when the mountains are blue, your beer is cold. So I always think it's really funny that like these types of technologies can be used in all these different kinds of ways, but there's no reason this couldn't also be used in a computational context as well. So I also explore different types of implants, so hence the term cyborg. So I have a number of implants I have them in my hands. I actually don't have this tritium implant anymore. I used to have a tritium implant in my arm. I recently traded it for an LED implant in my chest. And so basically, I am also experimenting with these different ideas of biocompatible materials. So what that's like to create materials that can, like, again, live symbiotically with your body, and what that's like. I would say it's okay, but needs work. But basically, the future is shaped by anything we can imagine. But what we can imagine is always an extension of what we know and what we see already. So a lot of my work takes place in this cone of lost possibilities. So if we look at, this is a speculative futures concept. So if you look at the past, as we make technological choices, our options become less and less until we get to the present or now. And then as we go forward, the possibilities sort of expand more, and we have our plausible, possible, and plausible, probable, and possible futures. But I like to think of the futures that exist in the lost possibilities. So the things that we have decided not to develop technologically. So this is something that exists in my world of lost futures. This is Reefa Miller. This is a piece that was done for Make Fashion in 2017 with my collaborator, Hilary Predko. And basically, it's a drone that's carrying the train of this dress down the runway. I will say the model was a real trooper. We definitely had to tell her several times, it's not gonna hurt you. She didn't quite know what she was getting herself into. But we created this to answer the question, what would it look like if a server room got married? So her bodice is made out of Ethernet cables, and it's painted with luminescent pigment, and she has UV lights, and she also has a skirt made with fans, like computer fans. So, we're trying this concept of taking, de-broing technology, as we call it. So, taking this drone that has a particular aesthetic and thought about it, and putting it on the runway. So, it was a lot of fun. It was a total blast. One of my favorite things that we had done with this was we realized that it needed like something to track, and I was like, oh, we'll just put a doily under it, and then it'll look for the doily. And someone's like, you mean a launch pad? I'm like, no, I mean a drone doily. So yeah, it was a real blast to think about. So I just, again, want to ask this question: what the squishy future is made out of? It's made out of, or if it's made out of biology, textile, liquids, elastic, flexible, changing fluid, or alive things. What types of things are we choosing to make our technology out of, and why are we choosing to do that? So this is sort of a different take. It's not a wearable piece, but it's a piece I did last year, and it's called Earth Resist, and it's a large sculpture by Lake Ontario, and it consists of these three big pieces like this, and they're the claws of the earth fighting back. It's the earth resisting what we are doing to it, and it responds with these large DMX lights to the weather as it changes by the lake. So it gets it gets very cold at night, and it gets very, very windy, and the weather is subject to a lot of fluctuation, particularly by the lake. So the sculpture reacts to that. But I also want to talk about, these ideas in our lost futures of technology and craft. Because for anyone really familiar with either of these processes, a lot of these words I have here, like silk screening, weaving, drawing wire, spinning, yarn, and soldering, they both apply to electronics and to craft material. So I think silk screening is one of the most clear examples. Silk screening you do on PCBs or circuit boards, but of course silk screening, making t-shirts, printing on fabrics and textiles. And there are a lot of overlap between these two processes. Again, one of my favorites is every time I teach craft people how to solder, I'm like, have you ever soldered before? And they're like, yeah, jewelry, and they're intimidated. But I don't know if you've ever soldered jewelry. It's terrifying. Like, soldering electronics has nothing on it. So, just like it's like a reimagining the perspective of these things and noticing how, even though socially these processes are very distinct, they're actually very much very aligned. And there's a lot of knowledge that you can have that's leveraged. And another great example is this is golden embroidery thread. When people talk about wearables and e-textiles and conductive textiles, gold is a material that's been used in clothing and intricately and in detail for just so long. But it's also a conductive material. So this is an example of an embroidered computer, and it's made with gold thread. And it's a functional computer, computer in a basic sense. It's using these alternative materials and leveraging these alternative knowledges to create this different paradigm of computation. For example, computers are running off at their core these types of binary on-off logic. And this is using a bead and a coil of gold wire to create this binary input in the same way. So it's flipping it back and forth, which is very similar to the way our computers are working, but on a different scale and different materials, leveraging different types of knowledge. So I like to call the class that I teach, This Can Be a Wire Too, because that's what it feels like all the time. I'm like, well, why are you using wires? Like you're talking about using coat hangers and using all these different things. Like, all of these things around us can be technology, and it's just about applying it. So technology doesn't feel or look like this because it's the best way. Nothing, nothing that we've made is the best, and I've really learned this especially throughout my PhD research. But it's because of a system of power and manipulation that dictates the material, processes, and techniques. So I like to think of soft electronics as resistance and as a form, as a political act that counters the type of technology that we're using. So by doing this and by leveraging these knowledges, leveraging your knowledge of craft, your knowledge of materials, you're first of all populating this cone of lost possibilities, but you're also reimagining something that could be useful when we're imagining, to bring it back to our space technologies, a future that we have yet to conceptualize, and different ways of engaging with the body that we haven't yet developed in the same capacity. But while we're here and we still live in our hard electronics world, I've been thinking about a lot about, especially for people just coming into electronics and just learning things. There are so many different little pieces of knowledge that I feel like, I personally feel like nobody ever told me. And at one point I was just expected to know those things. So I've written these 3 books, and they're for sale at the back if you're interested, or if you just want to kind of flip through them. But one is about wires, one is about buttons, and one is about LEDs. And these are often like the 3 first things you learn in electronics. They're like, yeah, just like wire up an LED and put a button on it, and you've learned this thing. But there's so much more to them, and they're actually there's a lot of like hidden terminology and hidden knowledge around it that we don't actually talk about. So a lot of this is just explaining things like, what is a solid core wire? What is a strand core wire? Like, nobody ever sat me down and told me that. So I remember a few times when I was first learning, I stripped a strand core wire, and I was like, what's wrong with my wire? A lot of this is just trying to get at those knowledge gaps that you don't necessarily have while we exist in this current technological paradigm. Just to sort of recap, designing technology for the body inherently requires thinking outside the current paradigm. And my collaborative practice with machines explores intersection of the body and concept of technology in the context of manipulating their implications towards the future. So how can we use this? How can we use these different types of knowledges to create different types of futures? So yeah, if you want to know more or chat more, of course you can reach me at these platforms. And yeah, thank you so much.
Wow, thanks so much, Lee. That was so interesting, and thank you also, Adrian, for sharing your journey in wearables. I think we can just open it up to the audience and field some questions or moderate some questions. Who's up?
Why don't you go first on that one?
Okay. Yeah, so a general rule of thumb is natural materials are better if you're working with heat. Synthetic materials, you don't want them to melt, and that could be bad. It really depends what you're doing. One of my favorite things to do is to take an LED and a battery and just go to the fabric store and put it behind different materials and see what it looks like. So of course there's like the safety aspect, and then there's like the aesthetic aspect. So that's my suggestion.
I think from my own experiences, and it's really limited at this point, but LEDs and the kinds of, with the power levels that you're working at, for a lot of these, they don't throw a lot of heat. So there's not often, there's stage lighting, right? When you've got, basically it comes down to wattage, right? Like power is power. So, if you're talking about something that is putting out 2 or 3 watts, and that's enough to get, this is putting out, if I had to guess, probably like 1/8 of a watt at most. And so there's really no risk of, like, it's not warm to the touch, it's not going to heat up. And so there's no risk of the fabric catching fire. Probably the only thing that I'm worried about is that I have a lithium polymer battery that's unshielded. They're very prone to combustion if they get punctured, or so that's probably the biggest safety element, would be like making sure that your power source is secure and safe. For me at this point, it's mostly just experimentation. You can wear things like, how long is something going to be able to run for? How much heat is it going to give off? What are the dangers and that kind of thing? You can do some back of the envelope calculations, but how well will this hold up to repeated manipulation? That becomes a bit more experimental. Usually, the more you can keep the movement to the areas where the wires are and things are flexible, then the better off you are. In the case of those strips, it's like they're flexible, but it's more like you're meant to install it in one shape and then leave it, as opposed to something that's constantly bending. But something like this, because all the LEDs are bunched together and it's a solid piece, it's flexible within its own movement, but as long as the board itself isn't subjected to extreme stress, then it's a lot more durable.
Yeah, I hate to give this answer, but it depends what you're doing. The fun thing about wearables is that there's not always a best answer yet, because it's an emerging field. Yeah, take it. It will become clear as you develop and like acquire them. But I'm happy to talk more. You can email, I think, at least me. I don't want to volunteer you. You can email me, and I'm happy to talk more about it with you. Yeah.
I have a 6-year-old daughter, and I'm amazed at how much of her current materials are powered by LED lights of some shape or form. What do you think the implications are, like on a more mass market scale, for wearables as we start seeing them in sneakers and in clothing that everyone is wearing?
Well, having to produce less of this material by hand will definitely make it easier to explore more stuff, right? Like and there's the biggest challenge for me so far has actually been like washing, right? So it's a lot of tech tends to be, I built these into earrings because of the fact that they don't really get dirty, right? So there's not, and the only part that really comes in contact with the skin for a long period of time is the choker, which can be completely separated from the electronics. So if I needed to wash it, then that's easily done. I'm hoping to work on more ambitious projects that would involve dresses and things like that. And I'm thinking that I'm probably going to have the electronics on like an underlayer that is detachable from the garment itself, so the garment can be washed. Because they don't really tolerate water very well. But like bringing down the costs, bringing down, especially when you can leverage like the things that industrial processes can produce are so much smaller and finer than things like, so there's, when I'm wiring things by hand, right, I've got, LEDs that are this big, but I've seen fairy lights that have the same kinds of functionality with the individual addressable ones that are the size of a grain of rice. And there's no way that I would be able to work with those materials unless they came prefabricated.
Yeah, I think you're hitting the nail right on the head there. Like, so much of the work and research that I've done is just about like the supply chain and viability of doing wearable technology. So there are a couple of projects that exist that have like made commercial level wearables. Like a good example is the Levi's commuter jacket that has an integrated like audio system, and a couple of uses the conductive fibers that are woven in. And Google Project Jacquard, they sort of work with artists and try and do this stuff. But the reason Google's able to do it is because they're working at a factory scale, and they're able to do that. And there's a few hacking factories, residencies and whatnot that sort of work on this factory scale. But that being said, like the Blinky shoes have been around for a long time, and they are like solid. So I mean. Hopefully we will get like access. Like right now we are starting to get access to being able to, like the average person be able to use industrial processes. So hopefully that filters down soon.
I would probably say the best option there is going to be just multiple paths, right? So if you've got, don't use one wire, use three. And if you can identify where the breaks are, you may also be able to, just like you would stitch a patch onto a torn piece of clothing, you can probably take more conductive thread and attempt to re-sew to fix that connection. But it's a fair amount of sleuthing, because you're going to have to take something like a multimeter and go piece by piece by piece to figure out where the break is.
I mean, that's like a problem that plagues us all. But a couple of solutions that I have found work really well is there's a couple of if you're finding that you're making things often enough that you're running into this problem, it's probably worth looking at something like a silver plated conductive thread. Or some of like the copper or higher end conductive threads that are a bit more robust. Another cool thing I like to use is magnet wire. So it's an enamel coated, very thin wire. And oh yeah, there you go. Yeah, you can use magnet wire. It comes so thin that you can put it in a sewing machine, and you can solder it. And it's awesome. And then the other thing, which is the least thread-like of the things I'm going to suggest, is silicone wire, which is just a regular wire, but it's very flexible, and you can sort of tie it, and it doesn't tend to break. Or you can also use multiple layers of fabric and like some sort of like heat and bond and literally sandwich them together, but it is a terrible problem, and I understand you. There's nothing wrong with buying like string lights or fairy lights that come with little battery packs. You can get them on like AliExpress or on Amazon, and especially the fairy lights, awesome. They're so good. And like EL wire, any of that, and just like like I think it's best that you start where you're comfortable. and work up.
Yeah, I actually have. So Costco's not a bad place for some of that kind of stuff. I have a set of like 4 of these fairy lights that come with a battery pack and the electronics, and you push a button and it cycles through 7 different modes, and the LEDs are actually like. So one of the properties of LEDs is that they only conduct electricity in one direction. So some of these fairy lights have white LEDs going one way, and then they have different colored LEDs going in the other direction, and then by flip-flopping the direction of the current, you can make different kinds of visual effects. And so it's all just kind of like, it's literally just a consumer product that it's just out of the box. And I've tried to look at like just sewing it into a skirt or something like that. It would work really well. The problem I had was with the battery pack, just because it's designed to run off of AAA batteries or AA batteries, it's really heavy. But the voltages, like, it wouldn't take a lot to say, well, let's just replace, the regular batteries with a lithium polymer battery. They're roughly comparable voltage ranges. It might work, and then you've reduced the weight, but it just sits inside the box, and you're still, because what you really want is the electronics and the button and the functionality, and it's just solving the power supply issue. And I mean, if you've got like a belt or you've got something that can bear the weight comfortably, then you can also just make that work, right? The hips small of the back. There's lots of places where you can hide, several ounces of weight and not have it be particularly problematic.
I mean, I really always say like be where you're comfortable. So of course, it's just like still every now and again when I like need to throw together a quick wearable, I'll tie some Christmas lights to a hat and call it a day. So like, and I think you can make some really cool stuff like that. So there's nothing at all wrong with doing that, but there are a bunch of sets, and the electronics that are made specifically to sew with conductive thread are called Lilypad Electronics, and they basically have, actually I think I might even have a picture of one. Actually, there's one on there, but I also have this picture. So this is the circuit board. It's this is an Adafruit Flora circuit board. It's the circuit board that powers Android Apparatus, and it has these like flat little pieces. Like you can see some of them I've soldered to, but basically they're flat, so you can tie the thread around it. Like that's like what allows you to connect. Like there's sort of custom-made circuit boards. I actually don't really use conductive thread because it's super annoying. But yeah.
For sure. And I, in fact, actually, so I have some LED eyelashes that I got at, they were clearing them out at one of the Halloween stores. And it was hilarious because it was like, most people they didn't know what they were looking at. They weren't selling. So they had started off at like $15 a piece, and they were down to $2.50 by the time I got them. And so I was like, I went and I grabbed one of every color. I got home and I was like, I should have bought more. And I went back the next day. And so I've got all of these pairs of these lashes, and they've got their own controlling software and whatnot. But the thing is that just with a little bit of investigation, I realized that these things are just like, they are fabricated in a way that I would never be able to make, but they use a well-known method called Charlie plexing to control them. And so I was like, there's nothing that says that I can't discard the box that came with it and then build my own controller to drive, so maybe a future version of the fairy wings will be able to integrate these lashes into the project as well, right? So that whatever it's doing, it's also driving those. So it's not much of it's actually not much further from buying something like a string of fairy lights from Costco to building something like this, because like in terms of this is just 3 wires soldered, and at the back they're just attached. This is using something called a Gemma M0, and it's another Adafruit product. All of their stuff is pretty much the same thing, where they've got these pads. They're actually designed to also fit screws. So like I didn't actually solder. I soldered to here for the because there really wasn't another option. But for the Gemma itself, it's actually just like bolted down. And I'll take this off later. You can take a look. But it's and from the code side of it, you can often find examples that will just drive a thing. So like if you want, you don't have to know much about writing it from scratch. You can take these platforms, hook them up, download some software, and then it's already there to an extent, and then it's just about like how do you want to modify it. So I was honestly surprised how small a step it is from having to work with what somebody sells you to being able to kind of go on your own path.
Yeah, so actually, if you want to just come back here, I'll just show you where everything is. So right here, this is the microcontroller. So this is like where all of the code lives. So you write a program and you upload it here. And then all these connections, they are connected to different, like all around the edge. They're connected to different sensors. So there's one sensor that's right here. And you can, oh man, it's having a weird time. Anyway, there's one sensor and it's called a tilt sensor. So it basically is just like a little conductive ball that falls back and forth. And then there's behind here, under here, there's an accelerometer. And the accelerometer detects how he's spinning, or so the orientation of that. And then there's like a little battery. So this is like all fully contained in the unit itself. And it all is just living. And like later we can take it, like when he takes it off, we'll have a look. And you can see where there's like felt, and the felt hides all the electronics. So this is fully self-contained in like a little piece of software that's basically the exact same that's powering her earrings.
So referring back to the AdaBox stuff, if you decide to jump in with a subscription to one of those things, then you get the box, and then when you go to the Adafruit site, they will have all the projects, step-by-step instructions, and you already have all the materials in front of you. There are other places like Make Code, where you can go and simulate software on these various devices in your browser and kind of play around with things that way. It's also a really good way to get your feet wet with the programming, because Make Code uses something called blocks, and it's basically, it treats programming like puzzle pieces. Everything is designed to fit together only in the ways that they make sense. So it's really hard to kind of go into the weeds with syntax, because you're just like, well, if these pieces clearly aren't meant to fit together, then they won't. Whereas if you're writing code at the language level, then there's all kinds of mistakes that you can make. So there's so many resources now for just getting into these things, and you don't even necessarily have to buy anything to just play around. And so many of the skills transfer from platform to platform.
Yeah, I would just second Adafruit. Adafruit's really awesome. They have like so many just super good tutorials. And the other good one is SparkFun. SparkFun also has really great tutorials, and they like, for specifically wearable stuff, like Adafruit would be like, this is how you do it. This is everything you need. Click this button. So yeah.
So maybe we'll close things up before we get to the demos. But I think I'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about Billy Porter's hat and how long until that hat technology is in the waking world. Did you see that at the Grammys? The retractable hat? Am I the only one?
Yes.
More hat technology.
Yeah, more hats.
So thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us here tonight, and we're gonna have a look at some of the great pieces here and circulate and have some questions and more dialogue. So thanks everyone. I think this concludes the formal looking at us part of the evening, and let's get our hands with some tech.